But more often than not, people don't understand coercive control or the psychological buttons that people push to get what they want.
In England and Wales, I spearheaded the successful stalking law reform inquiry. I changed the law on stalking, and I then set up an advocacy service, Paladin, the first national stalking advocacy service, and in fact the first world's advocacy service to help victims.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grizzly True Crime. My name is Gisela Kay. I'm South African, living in the Netherlands, and today we welcome a very special guest. Sorry for the little green screen problems here. I'm just quickly going to put this on. We're going to welcome a very special guest today, who's Laura Richards. Let me just quickly sort out my camera. Sorry, hold on one second. Okay. So thank you so much all for being here. I'm glad you liked the intro. So today, Laura Richards will be joining us. I've told you about Laura's channel before, which is the Crime Analyst. So go and check that out. The links are all in the description box to Laura's website, podcast, YouTube channel, TikTok, Instagram, everything, okay? Also on my community tab. So let me just quickly tell you a little bit about Laura. Laura Richards is a criminal behavioral analyst and an international expert on domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, homicide, and risk assessment. She's the founder of Paladin in 2013, the world's first national stalking advocacy service. Laura is the host of the Crime Analyst podcast and the Real Crime Profile podcast, and her YouTube channel is called Crime Analyst as well. And she's also the author of Domestic Abuse, Stalking, and Harassment and Honor-Based Violence, DASH for short, if you want to remember it, which is a risk model as well. And honestly, I could go on all day. I'm going to just tell you this just a little bit more. Just hold on one second. So, after a decade of analyzing violent crime at New Scotland Yard, Laura became the violence advisor to the National Police Chiefs Council, NPCC. Trained by world leaders at the Behavioral Analysis Unit, National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime at the FBI, and New Scotland Yard, Laura has applied her psychology degrees to analyze violent crime from a behavioral and presentative perspective. She's been the architect of law reform, which is amazing, to better protect victims on 8 occasions, okay? And as well as giving evidence in Connecticut, USA, and Queensland, Australia, both leading to successful outcomes regarding coercive control reform. Now, the thing is, there's so much more I could say. Laura's been on TV shows. You would know her from so many places. She's got books and everything that we're going to talk about. But for now, I would like to welcome Laura to the stream. Welcome.
Thank you. What a wonderful introduction, and it's fabulous to be here.
Yes, everyone is so excited. I see there's Grizzlies that are saying they love you and your content, so we are honored to have you here today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I have to say that having just launched my YouTube channel, a number of your wonderful subs I'm trying to get in with the lingo, you see, subs have come over to Crime Analyst and they say such wonderful things in their comments. So I just want to thank everybody and thank you as well for shouting out Crime Analyst and for having me on as a guest. Thank you.
Yes, it's a pleasure. And they say, love your voice. Very nice. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to all the Grizzlies. And please do go subscribe at Crime Analyst. So your handle is at Crime Analyst. It's all linked for you. And every 10 minutes, we'll be sharing all the links. Okay. So did you know that we launched a new emoji today, which is SPOB? We love the word. The word that you taught us. It's like I learned a new word from Laura, SPOB, the single point of blame. So yes, before we kick off with the other questions, what is a SPOB? So everyone knows.
So a SPOB is a single point of blame, or the single point of blame. And from working in law enforcement for 10 years for my sins, I did a decade at New Scotland Yard. I ran their sexual offences section and also the homicide prevention unit. And what I saw in the police culture was that when something catastrophic happened, the culture was to look for the SPOB, the single point of blame. And let me tell you, it was rarely an internal single point of blame. It was most often external, to attribute blame elsewhere. Look over here, don't look over here. So I did shout that out recently on a YouTube channel, and I do talk from my experience. So yes, SPOB came from working within the police.
Okay, great. Because the other day people are using it in the wrong context, but now we all know what SPOB is. So there you go. You heard it from Laura herself. I also like BGO, the blind, glaringly obvious.
Well,
Like,
it's the blinding glimpse of the obvious, the BGO, the thing that we can miss when we become so process focused. And that can also happen in murder inquiries and investigations where you have so much information coming in that sometimes the most obvious thing that's right in front of you, you can miss.
yes, exactly. So, what I would love to brag about, but if I'm going to ask you, you've recently achieved yet another milestone in law reform to better protect victims and prevent what you say is murder in slow motion. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so this is my 9th law change, and actually it's been my hardest one because it's taken 22 years, would you believe, to ensure that serial and dangerous domestic abusers and stalkers are on the same register as sex offenders. So we have the Violent and Sexual Offenders Register in the UK, and it exists in America and other parts of the world. But traditionally, sex offenders have gone on there and not the violent offenders. And when I was working in the sexual offences section and I headed that up at New Scotland Yard, I was saying repeatedly we should have the domestic abusers on that same register. And there's been pushback for 22 years for that to happen. And I launched a campaign working with lots of victims, survivors, families whose loved ones have been murdered, as well as professionals. And finally, the government announced that that would happen on February the 20th, that dangerous domestic abusers would indeed be added to the Violent and Sexual Offenders Register.
That is truly incredible. And I hope that goes global. I hope it happens everywhere.
I do too, because it's needed everywhere. But I think the important thing is that once it happens in one country, and because I do work across the world globally, then it can happen elsewhere, because the world is a small place now and everyone looks to, well, what's the good practice? Where else does it exist? How can we use that and maybe improve it? So I spend a lot of time helping people improve laws as well, of take all the learning and make sure that they do the best law reform that they possibly can. And that's how we keep improving and getting better to protect victims and their children.
Yes, I can't imagine 22 years of determination and vision. It must be such a relief to see it finally happen.
I mean, I can't tell you how I felt when I woke up and I saw in the media and everyone tagging me that it had been announced, and I just couldn't believe it. I sat bolt upright in bed. I literally ran down the stairs and was going through all of the press release, etc., and I burst into tears. And it takes a lot to make me cry, but it was just this release of 22 years. I mean, we thought it was going to happen after Sarah Everard was abducted and raped and killed by a serving Metropolitan Police officer who was a serial perpetrator. We thought it was going to happen then. And we, in Parliament, I worked with a number of peers in the House of Lords, and we basically pushed the government to a failure point where it was unanimous. People wanted this law change to come in, and we defeated the government. But in the House of Commons, the Tory government voted against us and voted down my amendment that I'd worked so hard on. And so it was just unbelievable to see that happening when the government had said post Sarah Everard that women's safety was a priority. And here they were voting down the amendment. But now they brought it in on February the 20th, selling it like it's their own idea, which it wasn't. I have 22 years of reports, which shows exactly where it came from and all the incredible survivors like Zoe Dromfield, like Cheryl Gabriel Hooper's daughter, Georgia, who Cheryl was murdered, and her daughter was a teenager at the time, and he murdered her, a serial perpetrator, in front of Georgia. And Georgia was part of campaigning for law reform, as was John and Penny Clough, whose daughter Jane was murdered. And these are all incredible people who have worked with me nonstop and have shared their stories nonstop. So it's right that the government should acknowledge them. And we are delighted that we believe that this will change and save lives.
Yes, absolutely. So well done for that. I see a lot of people, I can't even put all the messages on the screen. They're all just saying, congratulations, that is amazing and well done. So everyone is very proud of you.
Well, I hope people realize the significance of it, because one of the things that it will do is ensure that we focus on the perpetrator. And to me, that sounds bonkers, right? I've spent 27 years proactively and covertly tracking dangerous and violent men. And yet when it comes to this, and bearing in mind the police do it for organized crime, for terrorists, for robbers, for burglars, and yet I kept pushing and pushing, and they kept saying no, they weren't going to do it for domestic abusers and stalkers. Where else would you not focus on the perpetrator, right? We must look at them and the harm they're causing. And that creates a step change so that we stop looking at the victim and asking, but why did she do X, or why did she do Y, or why didn't she tell someone earlier, or why did it take her, why did she tell someone too quickly? Why about the victim? Why did she separate from him? These are all questions that are asked in every case. And I always say, but look at the perpetrator, ask questions of his behavior. What's he doing? And the question you must ask is, how do we stop him? So this will create a cultural shift that is so urgently needed. And that's why it's so significant that the histories of these violent and dangerous perpetrators will be on a database, and it will follow them around the country, and it won't be incumbent upon victims and, keep loading up victims with things that they should do, as if changing their behavior will stop a violent and abusive man, which it doesn't, and it won't. So we must focus on the perpetrator.
Exactly. Yes. I see everyone's agreeing with you as well. Laura is an amazing guest. Yes, exactly. They say, what took so long? Why didn't you leave sooner? Exactly. Those are the questions people ask. All those questions all the time. So speaking of that, what I think this goes, obviously, we're going to talk about domestic violence, violent perpetrators, and coercive control. So I thought maybe we could start with, what is coercive control? I mean, you've got a lot of resources on your website as well, which I will link for everyone. What is it, and what are the dangers of it?
Yeah, so coercive control is a pattern of behavior. It's a behavioral regime that predominantly a man will use to exploit, to entrap, to isolate, and utterly dominate a victim. And it tends to be, like I said, a male perpetrator, but there are some women who can be coercive controllers, but it's about utter domination of another. And when I describe it simply, I use one word, and that word is unfreedom. And it's where somebody takes away from the victim and reduces them, and gently and slowly and insidiously, this drip, drip, drip of eroding their agency, their autonomy, and their self-esteem. So they become dependent on the abuser. And it's where there's a power imbalance. So the power imbalance is at the heart of the offense. And that's also very important to understand. So when I changed the law on stalking, and that was after numerous murders when I was running the homicide prevention unit at New Scotland Yard, the first thing we wrote into stalking law is it's a pattern of behavior. And of course, stalking is about psychological terrorism. So I'd already proven that we could change the law for these insidious types of behaviors that perpetrators use. So if you like, I had a roadmap and a template. When people told me it was impossible, then that becomes a challenge for me when I say, well, we will make the impossible possible. And with coercive control, it was really the elephant in the room. There was no domestic abuse offense. And I wanted to ensure, when I listened to victims and they told me, Laura, the broken bones and the bruises aren't the worst part. It's the psychological terrorism. It's the emotional abuse. It's the mind game playing. these are the things that make the biggest impact here, not the broken bones and not the bruises. And yet we had legislation in the UK that just dealt with the physical stuff, and anything that was non-physical was completely ignored. And that did not make sense to me, having changed the law on stalking, having listened to victims, and that's what I spend my life's work doing. And listening to victims, 98% of them said we needed law change, that coercive control should be criminalized. I looked at the murders, and because I created my first law reform was domestic homicide reviews. Most of those murders, there was coercive control, the non-physical stuff. And why did we wait for somebody to separate from the abuser? Then things escalated. Then we would call it stalking, and then it would be a crime. And yet what happened pre-separation, if it was non-physical, was just ignored. So that didn't make sense to me. And that's why I started the campaign at Paladin, and Women's Aid and Sarah Charlton Charitable Foundation were part of that campaign. And we produced overwhelming evidence within a 12-month period that law reform was needed. And it was so compelling that it's the shortest and quickest campaign in the history of Parliament in England and Wales. And it led to December 2015, the new offence coming in. And we led the world with that happening. And now I'm working all across the globe to make sure victims' voices and their experience, that when they are subjected to coercive control, that everybody understands the risks and the dangers. Because ultimately, what we know is that coercive control correlates significantly with femicide, with familicide, when children are killed, and with suicide now. So that's why it's so important and significant. And I wanted women's experience and children's experience of what they're subjected to within the laws, so that laws were modernized to reflect experience of abusers, and that we get into early identification, intervention, and prevention, and that we save lives.
Yeah. So if someone is experiencing a relationship like that, what would you say they should do? Because I know there's dangers, of course, and a lot of people say just leave, but that's dangerous. That's one of the most dangerous times if it is a domestic violence one or a coercive control. So what would you suggest people do?
Yes, well, the first thing to say is that identifying that you are being victimized is not always easy. You might feel that something's not quite right, but the thing with a coercive controller is that they just move things up a notch from the general status quo of patriarchy and misogyny and a woman's role that is to be subjugated and to look after a man's needs and wants and desires, and to put yours as secondary. So the wake up for a victim can be at different times for them to understand it's not, jealousy isn't love and control isn't love. And a lot of people get confused between attentiveness versus control. And control is where you're micromanaged and there are rules and regulations of how you live your life. And if you don't follow those rules and regulations, there's a consequence. And that consequence normally induces fear. So the second thing to say is that separation is a high risk factor. So every case you want to take on its own basis, in terms of there's no template to say do A, B, C, and D, which is why working with survivors, why we have specialists to work with victims. And I'll call them victims first of all, because we don't know whether they will survive and get out. We want them to, and we want people to leave safely. And yes, it takes on average 7 times to effectively leave the male abuser. So it's a real challenge, because most people are in those relationships because they love the person, or they feel, emotionally connected to that person. They want to be with them. They just want the abuse to stop. And that's the problem, because it may not just stop. And when you decide that you've had enough and there's finality, that's when the risks can escalate. So what I will say is that if you're listening to me talk now and you recognize yourself in what I'm saying, then do call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you're in America, there's a helpline in Australia. In the UK, there's a National DV helpline that Refuge run. Do speak to an expert who can help with specifics to do with your case, because you can't just pack your bags in the middle of the night and flee and hope that that will be the end of it, because most oftentimes victims will go back because the perpetrator says the right things, or they're not set up to succeed with that leave. Maybe they didn't take their passports, or maybe they didn't take the baby's things that were needed. So leaving is a process and it takes time. So I always recommend people see it as a process and get the right advice and make sure you've got your support network set up, where you're going to go, the documents that you need, money that you can access. And with a coercive controller, unfortunately, they normally close down all those avenues. So it does take time for someone to re-establish and start to talk to people again and set up networks and get people to help them leave safely.
Yes, exactly. So someone mentioned in the chat now, Gabby Petito. And if you guys didn't know, Laura's actually done 20 episodes on Gabby Petito's case. It's absolutely brilliant if you haven't heard it yet. Breaking down every detail, including all the social media and everything, and just from the beginning to the end, which is a lot about coercive control. Do you think that sometimes, for example, in that case, the coercive control starts with the parents? Like with Brian Laundrie, do you think there is something with his mom, maybe based on the letters she's writing, do you think it like filters down, or where does it come from?
Yes, I mean, definitely listen to Gabby's series, and I have got a new episode that's about to drop on the updates. And why it went to 20 parts is because that's how long it takes to properly deconstruct what's gone on, right? I didn't know how long it would take me. I found lots of documents, like the review. I broke down the police body-worn camera footage, literally frame by frame. And I explained what I was seeing so that other people could see it, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Mm-hmm. Now, when we go back to, well, where did Brian learn this behavior? It's all around us, right? Mm-hmm. It's all around how girls and boys are socialized, their psychosocial development. And it starts when we're little. It starts where boys are being told, boys don't cry, and therefore to stuff your emotions down and don't emote. It starts with little girls being told to be modest, be polite, be kind, be grateful. Or little girls don't act like that, or little girls don't act like this, or this constant messaging, whether it's in music as girls get older and we start to realize how sexualized we are, and with boys of that they are the number one and that they are entitled, right? Male privilege that is over girls. And it happens from very early on that we learn those messages. Science kits for boys, not for girls. Things that are targeted. Girls are pink and fluffy, boys are not. All this messaging. And the point is that girls are groomed before they even meet the perpetrator. And boys feel entitled. They feel like, and I'm raising a little boy, by the way, so I say this in the full knowledge that the messages I give out to my little boy, Rafi, even as a toddler, are really important. Okay, every word that he hears from me sets the tone, sets the standard. So yes, in Brian's background, there will be those things. And when we understand that Roberta wrote a letter, Burn After Reading, where, according to Pat Riley, the family lawyer, she talked about burying a body and getting a shovel and helping him get out of prison, which she claims was predated the trip that Brian took with Gabby. And she's come out with all these words on a page, which I go through in my new episode. Here you have a mother who is clearly still trying to protect her son. And that tells us about the relationship, doesn't it? That yes, when Gabby disappeared, and bear in mind that Brian left Grand Teton and he drove across the country without Gabby in her van, and he arrives at his mother and father's house without Gabby, and they don't ask any questions. And when Gabby's mum and dad are calling, have you heard from Gabby? What's going on? They ignore their calls. They don't speak to them. This was a girl, Gabby, or I should say a woman, who lived with them, who they claim was a daughter to them. And yet they're not concerned that their son comes back without her, and they say nothing to anybody. So these are all very concerning behaviors. And actually, Roberta in the letter uses Gabby, which is very upsetting to the Petito family, given everything that has happened. So yes, what I always say is that abusers don't operate in a vacuum. Other people enable them, other people allow them and support them. And unfortunately, we do live in the patriarchy, and people might not like me saying the patriarch word, but I'm going to throw that bomb right in there, where there's misogyny and so forth. And that impacts because it green lights the abuser and it allows them to carry on behaving in the way that they are, just as the police stop with 4 officers, 2 of them fist bumping with Brian and laughing and joking. Gabby is alone in the patrol vehicle with the door shut, crying, emotionally dysregulated. How did it feel to Gabby hearing those officers laughing and joking with Brian? What was the message to her? Because all these things tell us the worth of a girl or a woman and the worth of a boy and a man. And we read it every day, whether it's at a work meeting, whether it's watching a TV show where a male gets 80% of the time and the female gets 20%. All these messages that are constantly being received by us of the worth of girls and women versus boys and men.
Yes, absolutely. That is so scary to think. I'm just visualizing that body cam footage again. I'm just, when they were, laughing with Brian and all that. I can't imagine how scared Gabby must have felt. She must have felt like she's, I call it like surrounded by a pack of wolves almost. Like she's isolated, just sitting there trying to deal with it. It was just terrible. Wow.
Well, I would imagine, a 22-year-old who's had no contact with law enforcement. I train law enforcement, and as I always say to them, you're intimidating. You turn up, you've got weapons, you've got a woman or girl who's in trauma, who's traumatized. Gabby was emotionally dysregulated. When someone's dysregulated like that, you instantly should be thinking about trauma, what's happened, but yet they didn't. And Officer Robbins initially went down that path. He separated them out, but he put Gabby in the patrol vehicle in the back where perpetrators go. That's where you put people when you're arresting them and cuffing them. And he put her in there, and they let Brian just stand outside, and then they're just joking around. 75 minutes that stop was. And the message to Gabby was, well, she tried to tell Officer Pratt what had happened, and he just changed the subject. But what was also very interesting was that Brian told the officers immediately that he had locked Gabby out of the van and that he had pushed Gabby first. That's what he said initially. They ignored that and they went straight for when Gabby was taking responsibility immediately, that it was all her, and that, oh, well, I hit him first. But she said Brian put his hand round her whole face, okay, and a man's hand around a woman's face, that's the equivalent of asphyxiation, stopping her breathing. His nails went and broke her skin. And she tells Officer Pratt that, and he changes the subject. He asks about Brian's driving. He didn't say, can you get out of the vehicle so I can see your face, or tell me about exactly what happened. No follow-up questions. Well, the important thing here is that we know when hands go around the face or neck, that it increases the risk 7-fold to serious harm and femicide. And weeks later, Gabby was found, her human remains were found, and the cause of death was strangulation. That's how serious it is. You don't get a second chance in these cases. And Gabby was being told her worth the whole time through that police stop, that she wasn't listened to. She tried to tell them, but they didn't understand their own laws. And she wasn't the predominant aggressor. If they understood their own laws, they would know that Brian was the predominant aggressor. And of course, there is a lawsuit now against Moab City Police. But why I did the episodes was because I wanted people to really understand this insidious behavior and how perpetrators can flip the script and Darvo a victim with their own poor me syndrome that they center themselves as the victim, and how quick it is for officers to take the side of the abuser, despite the fact the 2 911 calls said the gentleman was slapping the girl. Despite what Gabby told them, despite what the evidence said, that they took his narrative. And that's what I keep mentioning when I say, well, the woman's worth, why does it take more than 100 victims to say that Harvey Weinstein was a sexual predator and his narrative is believed over and over? That's what we have to keep attuning to. That's why Gabby's case is so important, so that we really learn those lessons and that experts like me talk out to help the rest of the world understand what went on. So sorry, that's a very long answer, but I feel really strongly, particularly when women and girls are murdered after asking for help, after doing everything right, and yet those things were missed and overlooked because of misogyny, and misogyny kills, and it's that serious.
Yes. Lieutenant Peter Pranzo in the chat says, Laura, he worked at the NYPD. With more women in law enforcement, have you observed a difference in the way that police interact with female victims?
Well, I think it's going to take some time to get senior police leaders, for there to be more senior female police leaders. And I think culturally it's going to take some time, because unfortunately still it's a very male-dominated industry. And that culture, I've worked in it 10 years, I did a decade in it. And I can say you experience that misogyny and that sexism every second of every day. And it's very hard when you're in the minority to speak out and to do something about that. So I think it's going to take quite a long time. And of course, in the UK, we've seen New Scotland Yard, where I used to work in the media repeatedly, after Sarah Everard and Wayne Couzens, who was called the rapist, and then David Carrick, who was called Bastard Dave by his colleagues. And yet 17 years he was offending against women, 9 complaints, and they did nothing. And it's going to take a long time to change that. And it starts with leadership. And that's where I point my lens when I talk about these cases. And when I talk to police officers and I train them, it's the leaders that need to create this change. They are responsible, and it will start to trickle down. But yes, bottom up and top down. And we do have to make sure that the culture is one of empathy and non-judgment. And in fairness to the police, where they have quality expert trainers who train them, people like me, not just a trainer who trains on road traffic collisions one morning and then they do an hour on domestic abuse, because that just does not cut it. That is not enough training, and you need to have an expert-led training session. And that's what Her Majesty of Inspectorate has said repeatedly when they've inspected police forces in the UK and the Crown Prosecution Service. It must be expert-led training, and you have to challenge the attitudes, the mindsets, the culture. And when you do that and you hold people to account, when they do terrible things like Dave Carrick and Wayne Couzens, we shouldn't be waiting for it to get to that stage. We should be making sure that if someone's reported for domestic violence or sexual violence, that they are properly investigated and held to account for that behaviour. If we can't do it on the inside at New Scotland Yard within the police service, what hope is there for anybody else?
Yes, exactly. Is that the
Let
savage
me quickly
little
let my
beast?
golden doodle out. Hang on,
Yes.
You might be able to hear her.
It's the golden doodle, you guys. Laura's posted pictures of a golden doodle on Twitter as well, and hashtag savage little beast. I like that.
That's right. Beatrice represents. She's
Yes.
always likes people to know she's around. Sorry about that, folks.
Oh, no. We love it. One question I had, which you actually answered on, I can't remember if it was a video that you did or your podcast episode, but in case anyone hasn't heard it, if someone says to you, based on your work to protect women and children, that you're a man hater, what is your answer to that?
Yes, that's a classic, which is said all of the time to me. And I always say, I love men. I love men. I love my fiance. I love my baby, who's a baby boy. What I don't like is abusers. And I have a very hard line on them. And we should all have zero tolerance on men who abuse women and children and who abuse other men. And we should all speak out about that, because actually we are the majority, those who are the non-abusers. And if we work together to hold those abusers to account, the world would look like a very different place. And I will always say to men who say that I'm a man hater, I always ask them what they're doing about male violence and why they aren't talking to the men who are abusing women and girls, because that's where their energy should be directed, not at me, who's identifying the problem and have actually done 9 law changes in 27 years to try and challenge and change culture, written books, podcasts, and so on. I've been trying to create that change, but actually the change will only really happen with men and men holding other men to account. And I feel very strongly about that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And someone saying abusers can be male or female, but the stats, even if not, you're fighting the fight against violence against women.
That's
your fight.
right. And I don't like the conversation being changed. The problem is that women are being killed at a disproportionate rate, and children are being killed at a disproportionate rate by men. And if we don't name that problem, and if we don't have that conversation, we're constantly going to be changing the channel. And yes, men can be victims, but most men are victimized by other men. So if we turn it on its head and say male violence is the problem, and we all focus on why men do that and holding men to account, then we'd start to make some headway. And when we say that women matter, we're not saying that men don't matter or male victims don't matter, but we're saying we need help with the issue that women and children are being disproportionately murdered by men. And save the whales doesn't mean I don't care about the dolphins. So it's an important point because people change the channel all the time and deflect on this disproportionate amount of women and children being killed. 4 to 5 women are murdered every day by a man here in America, a man who was meant to love, care, and trust and look after them. 4 to 5 women. In Australia, it's 1 woman a week. And in the UK, it's 1 woman every 3 days. And those statistics, they're conservative because there's no real one place to go to count all of those cases. And it doesn't include children. This is women. So actually, it would be far greater than that. And it's a big disservice to say, oh, no, but men can be victims too when we're talking about male violence towards women and children.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I wanted to talk more about stalking. I suppose that's a totally separate topic. There's people in the chat also asking about it because there was that podcaster that was recently murdered, her and her husband, by a stalker. So that affects all of us. You're a podcaster. I'm here on YouTube. I mean, that is a very scary example. So what would be an early warning sign of stalking behavior and what should one do about it?
Yes, Sureh Sadeghi was her name, and Mohammed Nazari, the husband, she was stalked actually for a much longer period of time. And it was because she was podcasting and he contacted her via Clubhouse. Initially, it looked like a normal conversation, but then he started to do things that really concerned her. And he was sending her 100 messages a day. He was calling her husband. He was calling her contacts and her friends. He was turning up at her home address. And more importantly, he would turn up at her home address when her husband left and give her flowers, which tells you that he had her house under surveillance. He was watching her. And so these are all things that if you take them in isolation may not sound like a big problem. But she knew it was a big problem and she was calling the police. She was in fear for her life. He had threatened to kill himself and self-immolate on her favorite tree in the grounds of her property, and he'd threatened to kill her. And what we know about stalkers, that if they make a threat to kill, 1 in 10 of them will, if there's no relationship with the victim, and 1 in 2 of them, if there is a relationship with the victim, will act on that. 1 in 2, half. So there is a connection here with coercive control because many stalkers stalk to get power and control over the victim. And this is a horrific case, and sadly, I've worked far too many of them, and it should alarm everybody, certainly people like us who are podcasters and who put our work out there, where fans, that's short for fanatics or fanatical, there can be a healthy interest and obsession, but there can also be a very unhealthy obsession and fixation. And he crossed over to the unhealthy fixation and obsession. He was intrusive in her life, in real life, and therefore it should have been taken seriously when she was reporting to the police. And as I always say, I changed the law on stalking. I set up Paladin to help victims of stalking. At your worst time, you need the best response. And unfortunately, this lack of urgency and this inability to understand what she was saying, it's just not good enough. And not in 2022 and 2023, when there's so many good resources like Paladin and others who can help. And therefore, what the police did was they said, get a protective order, a piece of paper. And a piece of paper they hadn't served on him because they said, because he was a truck driver and he was from Texas, they couldn't get to him. But they had warned him on January the 16th. So why didn't they arrest him then for stalking, which is what they should have done? And as I always say, a piece of paper protects no one. It's not bulletproof. It's not stab proof. And the phrase, as I always say, do your damn job, because people's lives depend on it. And unfortunately, when women report, they're not taken seriously. And this, to me, is a prime example of that happening. And the impact and effect is catastrophic. It was actually her mum. She was living at the property too. He broke in the middle of the night into her room. She tackled him first. And he had a gun on him. She then ran to the neighbor's house, called 911. But it was too late because he shot both of them and then turned the weapon on himself. And that's a murder in slow motion. I trademarked that murder in slow motion, that drip, drip, drip that happens before the catastrophic event. That's when we should be acting. And having worked in law enforcement, if you don't know what to do with a case, call an expert who does. You can call up Paladin for free, but you've got to want to make the effort and do something about it rather than just throw your hands up in the air and say, we'll get a protective order. I mean, these are the most dangerous of cases. So I do get very I get very upset hearing about case after case when all the lessons are the same.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We kind of know how you feel. I mean, you see a lot more cases, but even just following all these true crime cases, like the patterns are there. It's the same story every time. It's very, very sad.
But I think one of the problems is, in the true crime world, people just tell these, grisly stories and that's it, as if we should just accept that violence and abuse happens. Well, all my work for 27 years has been about prevention. We should be trying to actively engage people to do something about it, not just tell this horror story about something that happened. I want everybody to think, well, what can we do about it? Because we can all be active. And that's where all my work about intervention and prevention and why Crime Analyst is so important. I'm not just telling stories, and storytelling is important, right? It is, because it changes hearts and minds and takes us on a journey. But it's also important for people to be active. Well, what can we do about it? Because there are always intervention points where if action had been taken, there may have been a very different outcome.
Exactly. I just want to show them as well. So you guys, if you haven't listened to Laura on Crime Analyst podcast, please go check it out. It's really in-depth detail. There's so much expertise that we can learn from here. I know you guys relate to me because I'm just like you, besides being here on camera. We look at true crime because we've been through some stuff, and then we're trying to learn and trying to stay safe as well. But I mean, I'm not an expert, and Laura is. You should really check out this podcast and her channel, which is also Crime Analyst. And you've also got another podcast with Jim Clemente, Real Crime Profile. This is all really good stuff. Like, highly recommend. Literally, not sponsored, not being asked to say anything. This is what I listen to in my free time because I learn so much and I find it so soothing based on everything that I've been through. So I'm sure you will too. I know you have to go in a few minutes. Let me see if there's anything. Is there anything you want to tell us about that I didn't get to ask you? I wanted to ask you about your DASH model and courses that you might offer and things like that.
Yes, well, and thank you for shouting out Real Crime Profile as well. And we have just covered Zohreh Sadeghi and Mohammed Naziri's case. So please do check that out. And we've solved a cold case on Real Crime Profile. And just to say, I'm a real person as well, right? I've been through some shit, which is why I do what I do. And I don't want other people to go through it. And that's why it's important. And I hope that, people understand, I'm relatable as well. I have lived experience. And, what I'm trying to do is raise the awareness, educate people, and make us active. that the world doesn't just happen to us. And I 100% believe violence and homicides are preventable. And as I always say to people, when I explain coercive control, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Then it's about, well, what are you going to do? And that's what I said about the first murder that I reviewed of a woman called Christine Boswell, where a detective said to me, it was so obvious he was going to kill her, Laura. And I said, well, how do you know that? And I went through the crime report and I was like, wow, it was a textbook case of nonverbal arguments right through to physical assaults, to him shredding her clothing with a knife, to him then stabbing her multiple times in front of the two children. And there it all was, laid out in black and white. This was my first domestic homicide review in the process. And I said to the detective, so if you knew he was going to kill her, what did you do? And that was the hardest question, right? I asked difficult questions and he couldn't answer it. And that's not a criticism of him. It's just that oftentimes we're not in the active and proactive, as I call it. And if we just switch that gear and we have the right knowledge and information, i.e. we listen to crime analysts, we listen to Real Crime Profile, listen to the experts, we understand those warning signs, then we can all be active in that process. And that's why all of the work I do is so important and why it's different from other behavioral profilers and analysts. It's not just this case, it's taking lots of them. And the DASH is the sum of all the learning of a risk toolkit, the what can you do part for law enforcement that I've spent decades training officers and others. I train everybody on it, but all of the UK use it currently. And I'm running new classes actually. On May the 9th and 10th, I'll be running a class on stalking, how to understand the warning signs, the victimology, the behaviors, the psychology of the stalker. And I'm asked that a lot. So that's on May 9th, 10th. I'm running DASH training, the Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Harassment and Honor-Based Violence Risk Model, on May 23rd and 24th. Coercive Control, how to understand the behaviors, the victimology and the psychopathology of the perpetrator. That's on June 6th, 7th. And DASH Train the Trainer on June 20th and 21st. And you can email laurarichardspa@gmail.com if you're interested. It's open to everybody. As I always say, if you're a mom, a dad, a brother, a sister, you may know someone going through it. I have survivors come on as well as professionals. But why I run these training sessions and I get up at 5 a.m. in the morning, if people in UK time to hit UK time, is because I'm heavily invested in teaching people, using my knowledge and sharing experiences and ensuring that we use the lifelines that we have, that could be the you, the me, asking the right questions, being curious, and telling victims, always trust your instinct. Or even as a professional, always trust what your gut's telling you. In our stomachs, we have more brain cells than a dog has in its head. I'm sorry, Beatrice, but that's the truth of the matter. So we should listen to our gut and not let our rational mind override what our gut is telling us.
Okay. Yes, that's very good advice. Also, so it is for the public as well. It's not just police people. Anyone can sign up for the course, right?
That's correct.
Wonderful. And is that on the laurarichards.com, on your website there?
It's on the Dash Risk Checklist website and also on the laurarichards.com. Yes.
Okay.
And if you email laurarichardspa@gmail.com, you get all the details. If you follow me on social, all my socials, I've put out an up-to-date newsletter that went out yesterday with the victory about the campaign, the 22-year campaign, and what that means, as well as the new training classes, the master classes, as I call them.
Well, Grizzlies, are we going to all see each other there? I'm sure we're all going to, your inbox will be flooded soon. We'll be signing up for your classes. I'd be so excited to be part of that as well.
And just to say, Crime Analyst is a lot of the support material. Before you come into my masterclass, you'll be asked to listen to certain episodes because we discuss them in detail. And therefore, everything that I do is a learning experience and is part of my training classes, right? And as I always say to people, I'm not just a podcaster, or YouTuber. It all has purpose. And I know there's lots of, incredibly curious people out there that are hungry for knowledge and information. And as I always say, be careful who and what you put in your ears. You want to put the best information and knowledge. And when we listen to a podcaster or YouTuber, we should come away feeling smarter. right?
Yes.
Feeling that we've learned something. And that's my intention. So I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate all your subs and everyone coming over to Crime Analyst as well, and the work that you do. And I appreciate you shouting me out and spending time with you today. So thank you very
Yes.
much.
Yes, and thank you. You are welcome back anytime. The door is wide open. Because these topics are so important. I mean, it's quite hard to fit into even 45 minutes, and we've gone overtime. You said you have 45 minutes.
We did. And I know my little guy is just about to have his lunch, so you'll be starting to hear from him too. So you'll get a full family experience. So yes, I live a
Yes.
very full life, which I'm very grateful for. And, you know, when you're doing this work, it's not easy and it does have an impact. And when you talk about cases, for me, they're not just cases. I immerse in them and I live it, I eat it, I breathe it, every part of it. And you know, what's really important about Gabby's case is that could be any one of us, and her parents are fighting for justice and accountability. And I'm 100% with them in seeking justice and accountability. And that's really important. So the updates are about 3 key important things that have happened with Gabby's case, and it is ongoing. And part of what the family want is that people understand what coercive control is, and that laws are modernized and updated. And that's exactly what chimes with me and the work that I'm doing. So thank you all very much for listening. I know I've given some very long answers at times, but it is
no, we could listen to you all
complicated
day.
issue.
Someone earlier said, Raging Wolf said, as a survivor of DV, I'm sitting here nodding my head so much to all Laura's words, my neck is hurting. Even I'm nodding along. Wow, we're just soaking up all of the knowledge that you're sharing with us. And
good. I'm really pleased to hear that. And that is a really good use of my time. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes. If I may ask one more question, because people will literally be upset if I don't. Could you share a quick, what are your concerns on Nicola Bulley's case? Because I see the comments are all asking. They'd be like, why wouldn't you ask that question? So do you have any, I know I shared your video 2 days ago on your concerns. And today, is there anything you could share in closing on the case?
Yes, I have many concerns, and I spotlighted 3 of them in the last video. And this Friday, I'll be going through all the other concerns that I have. My work isn't just about seeing one thing in isolation. It's seeing the continuum of things. And what really worries me is the police decision-making in the context of everything that's going on in the UK right now. And in cases like Melanie Hall, who disappeared from Bath, that wasn't treated as a priority, Susie Lamplugh, who disappeared in London, you know, the golden hours aren't treated as a priority. Then you have other cases like Claudia Lawrence, where it wasn't prioritized when she went missing. And I've worked so many of these cases. I'm working a case at the moment, Marion Barter, and you'll hear me talk about Marion Barter's case again. She disappeared in Australia and the police just said, oh, she took herself off. So I always look at that initial starburst of when someone's reported missing and what's the activity that the police are engaged in. And when there's a shift of focus and when we're being told certain things, but yet the evidence doesn't corroborate what's being said, that's a point of concern. When you have specific circumstances, which I've talked about with Nicola's case, that are unusual, then a case should be escalated up, not closed down to a very small timeline and people being told, well, it's not a crime. Equally, sharing things about someone's specific vulnerabilities at a press conference almost 3 weeks down the line, saying that you won't elaborate, and then you elaborate within a couple of hours. My question about that decision is, why did that happen in that timescale? i.e., they said they weren't going to share, then they did. And what was going on in the background? Well, I now have a good sense of what was going on in the background, and I'm going to share that on Friday. And it's important when we put it in a context that the Independent Office for Police Conduct were notified there was a previous contact with Nicola, and they were called to her home address on January the 10th. And there is now an independent review of that contact. Why did that come out later on? That's a question that I have and that I'll be answering on Friday, because I have worked many of these cases on the inside. I've also sat on the what was the Independent Police Complaints Commission group when they are investigating what the police did or didn't do. So yes, I have inside knowledge of how things should go. And what bothers me the most is this silencing of people, saying that we shouldn't talk about Nicola's case. And then there's a single point of blame attributed to Peter Faulding. That bothered me. And then we see the Police and Crime Commissioner speaking out, saying that he wants a review because he wants to understand how the narrative ran away from the police. That's a deflection and shift of focus. That should never be the point or focus of a review. But there he was talking to the BBC. Not one of these things on its own would be the biggest red flag. It's all these things together joined up. And I want to ensure that there are true lessons, true learning for the next case that happens, the next woman who goes missing, the right things occur, and that there isn't this defensiveness. But at a time where we have a culture of misogyny being revealed, and I'm using those words specifically, being revealed, many of us knew that it was the case for a very long time, then the police making these decisions in this context is concerning. And it's right that people should ask questions. Look, I'm not a big fan of the conspiracy theories. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about decision-making when a woman goes missing, and there should be some transparency and there should be accountability. And right now there are about 6 reviews that are ongoing. I believe that there should be an independent inquiry outside of the police looking at everything that went on and the decisions the police took. And that must happen rather than their own organizations, be it the College of Policing or IOPC, doing different disparate parts and us not having a true join up. And I'll say much more on Friday about my other concerns and how they all join together. But as I always say, be curious, ask questions. We shouldn't just take it as read that it was A, B, or C. We should ask questions, and there does need to be accountability.
Yes. So thank you so much. What I'm going to do now is spend some time showing all your websites and your YouTube channel and your podcast and all. I know you have to go. You got to feed your son, and it's busy times there for you. I really, really appreciate the time you spent here with us. It absolutely flew by so fast. And I enjoyed it very much, and I could see the audience did too. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yes, tune in on Friday. You'll hear a little bit more, and to the Gabby case as well. And I appreciate your time and space afforded to me answering the questions. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And we'll see you again soon. And we'll all be there on Friday. We'll look at your podcast,
Wonderful.
your YouTube channel, and everything. Thank you, and have a lovely day further.
And you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
bye.
Okay, everyone. I just wanted to quickly just show you Laura's all the links are in the description box, but I just want to show you so that you can at least just see. So Laura says, be curious, ask questions, and trust your instincts. I'm glad that you guys all enjoyed it. Me too. The time flew so fast. I mean, I still had about another 10 questions written down here. It just goes so fast. So this is crime-analyst.com. And this is where you could find all the links to the various platforms where the Crime Analyst podcast is. And you can listen to all of that. I know a lot of you in my community followed Gabby Petito's case. And so you guys, you have to listen to the Gabby Petito episodes, 20 parts, as I say, and it's so good. You're going to love it. I haven't listened to all of them. I'm about halfway through, but it's really good. And then we've got her channel here, Be Curious, Ask Questions, Trust Your Instincts, Crime Analyst. And her handle is @CrimeAnalyst. Congratulations to Laura. A few days ago, she hit 10K subs and she was so excited about it. So make sure you go subscribe over there. If you are part of this community, say, hi, I'm a Grizzly, or coming from Grizzly to Crime or whatever. So go over there. That'll be exciting. Then we've got Laura's website, thelaurarichards.com. This is now resources that I've got here. So let's just go back like this. You can see about Laura Richards. So there's so much more that I couldn't even include in my intro, that Laura's achieved, that she's done in her life. So go to this website, thelaurarichards.com, so that you can learn more about Laura and her work. So you could see here she says her work, case consults, masterclasses, keynote speaking, TV and production, and podcasts as well. Here's Jim Clemente as well. You guys are saying you subbed over there. That is awesome. I'm so glad that you're subbing over there. Here's the Dash Risk Checklist and awards. Look at this section, awards received. I mean, sorry, I'll make it bigger for you guys. Can you believe it? Amazing, right? So Laura is such a role model to me, and I honestly find her podcast and all her content very soothing. And I feel like if I can relate to it, a lot of you will relate to it. And as I said before, we've been through a lot of stuff, and it just is so soothing to hear from an expert, you know, how to process certain things, how to spot red flags without everything being a suspect. You know what I mean? Like, what are the actual red flags? What are we dealing with? How do we stay safe? How do we prevent being victims of crime? How, you know? So go and have a look at that. Here as well. I'm just showing you. And here's Beatrice. So cute. So we've got that. Okay. We've also got crimeanalyst.com about. So here's a whole about Laura as well. I'm just quickly showing you so that you know what is in the links. Okay, now this is the International Coercive Control Conference, and Laura is a speaker here, and I see it's happening November this year, so we'll keep an eye on that. I look forward to learn lots from all these speakers, and if we just scroll down here, Laura's listed here. Okay, so we've got that. This is Laura's other podcast with Jim Clemente, former FBI profiler. Shout out to Jim Clemente as well. And this is Real Crime Profile, another really great podcast. So all of these links, as I say, this is the case we were talking about. I have a YouTube short on this, but Laura and Jim did a deep dive in their Real Crime Profile podcast on the case of this podcaster being killed by a stalker. And her husband was also killed. A very, very sad case as well. Here, Laura's got Dangerous Domestic Abusers Campaign Victory, a new masterclass dates announced. This is the newsletter that Laura was talking to. And you can find all of these links on the website that I've linked for you, which is thelaurarichards.com. Okay. And so today, what we touched on was coercive control, domestic violence, stalking, and there's so much more that we could talk on as well. So maybe one day Laura will join us again. It was, of course, yes. So Java Junkie says her voice is powerful and mesmerizing. I know, right? Forever Curious says, great guest, Gisela. Thank you for inviting Laura to talk. Her advocacy work is of vital importance. I know, right? Okay. So thank you so much all for joining me today. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one. Make sure that you go subscribe to the Crime Analyst, listen to the podcast. Let me know what you think as well. And I will see you very soon. Thank you, Marge. Thank you, everyone. Bye.